George Harley was the son of a Methodist priest. He was born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina, along the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he studied biology at Trinity College, what is today Duke University, where he also dreamed of someday following in David Livingstone's footsteps and becoming a medical missionary in Africa. While Harley is studying at Trinity College in 1914, there are some important changes occurring in Liberia which would lay the groundwork for his missionary work there. In 1914, the Liberian government installs a district commissioner in the town of Saniquelli in order to guard the contested border with French Guinea. And by the early 1920s, the central government has a strong military presence in the town of Ganta. As Ganta is being settled by the Liberian government forces, George Harley went on to Yale Medical School, where he earned his medical degree and also his wife-to-be, Winifred Jewel Harley. In 1924, George Harley is assigned by the Methodist Episcopal Board of Missions to work in northeast Liberia. He says in regard to his appointment, quote, "Our place will be one of the few remaining frontiers of the world. We will not consider our work complete until there is a church, a hospital, and a school, substantiated by the essentials of civilization, of which the Christian home is the most important." End quote. As this article was being printed, Harley spent the better part of a year at the Kennedy School of Missions, what is today known as the Hartford Seminary, a progressive program that stressed anthropological concepts of cultural relativism and respect for indigenous culture over mass conversion to Christianity. In fact, Harley spent very little time in Liberia engaged in proselytizing, only attending Sunday Mass and Bible study. The rest of his time he spent mainly in medical work, house and furniture construction, brick making, timber sawing, iron working, and, as we shall soon see, collecting art and artifacts. In early 1925, George and Winifred Harley travel from New York City to London, where Harley studies for several months at the Tropical Institute of Medicine, and then on September 1925, they go on a ship to Monrovia. In early 1926, they travel to Ganta, what was a 2-week journey by foot, with over 50 hired men to carry their supplies. Ganta is situated in the heart of 5 major ethnic groups, all of whom have a rich history of masking and art production: the Kapele, the Mano, the Dan or Geo, the Kron, and the Wegere. The question is, how does George Harley begin to collect masks from these different ethnic groups that surround the mission in Ganta? Collecting is not part of the missionary role as defined by the Kennedy School of Missions, and as far as we know, his only exposure to African art or material culture is a brief 1-hour visit to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which he describes in a letter in January 1925. We know the first object that George Harley buys is a Fulani or Pole herder's hat, which he acquires in 1926 within a few months of arriving at Ganta from an itinerant Muslim trader. Harley's collection of sacred material, that is, masks and objects associated with rites of initiation, only begins after he can make inroads into Mano and Dan cultures in the region of Ganta. On January 28, 1927, Harley awakens early in the morning to cries that the leopard that had been killing livestock on the perimeter of Ganta was spotted. He loads his double-barrel shotgun and spends the next several hours tracking the leopard, which he successfully shoots and kills. He's so proud of his achievement of having shot this leopard that he inks the front paw in his diary and describes how the village is grateful to him for having killed the leopard that was destroying their livestock. This was his first, if you will, moment of acceptance by the indigenous community. Although it's difficult to know exactly when George Harley became interested in collecting art and artifacts, we do know that in 1928 he was visited by George Schwab, a Presbyterian missionary and Harvard-affiliated amateur anthropologist who had been working for several years in Cameroon, where Schwab was himself collecting artifacts, including this pair of Fang reliquary figures, which is in the Harvard Peabody Museum collection today. Schwab encouraged Harley to collect for Harvard, and he also puts Harley in touch with Professor Ernest Houghton, who was the head of the Anthropology department at the time at Harvard University. Between 1930 and 1948, George Harley shipped to the Peabody Museum at Harvard about 400 masks, along with another 400 artifacts, including both ritual paraphernalia and household items such as baskets, chairs, fishing nets, etc. His first shipment of artifacts in 1933 to the Peabody Museum included 19 masks, but his second shipment in 1937 included 329 masks. There was clearly a period of rapid acceleration in mask collecting. The Harleys were visited in Ganta in 1935 by Graham Greene and his cousin Barbara Greene. In her 1938 book, Too Late to Turn Back, Barbara and Graham Greene in Liberia, she described the locked closet where Harley apparently stored hundreds of masks. Quote, "During one evening in the dusk when the light was dim and somber, Dr. Harley took us to a room that he kept locked up. Looking over his shoulder to make sure that no one was about, he slipped in, and we followed. All round us we saw strange masks of every kind. Cruel faces grinned at us, and other, ugly and grotesque, seemed almost alive. We were surrounded by them, and they were all hideous, though carved with great skill. I could find no beauty in any of them, but they were certainly a valuable and unique collection." One of the interesting questions that I'd like to pursue here is why were people selling sacred mass in such large quantities between 1928 and 1948? I think there are several reasons for this. During this period, there was a government prohibition on poro. The central government in Liberia was threatened by the power of the poro associations, and soldiers from government posts across this region of Liberia were charged with enforcing the ban. Even as late as 1954, we see government seizures of contraband poro paraphernalia in this photograph taken by Dr. Wallace Peters, a British medical doctor who had visited George Harley at the Ganta mission. A second reason why so many masks were coming out and being sold to Harley during this period was the imposition of a hut tax in the Liberian Interior. As a way of extending their control in the interior and creating an economy of forced labor to supply the Firestone rubberstone plantation, which had been established in 1926, the Liberian government taxed individual dwellings in interior villages. The tax had to be collected by local chiefs in the new coin and paper currency issued by the British West African Bank. If they could not pay the taxes, huts were burned and people were sent to jail and publicly shamed and beaten. Although Harley fails to remark on the specific reasons why people sold him the masks, his wife Winifred does write the following in her memoir. Quote, "When they knew that my husband bought old things, they were tempted by the chance to shift the responsibility, get the troublesome things off their hands, and come into a sum of money as well." The third reason why so many masks were being sold during this period was a loss of power by the elders. The elders, who traditionally had been responsible for the caretaking of the masks and the caretaking of the traditions associated with the masks, were being challenged by younger generations who were being schooled at the mission. In a way, then, there's a certain irony in the fact that the establishment of the Ganta mission by George Harley and the changes that the mission brought on this region, in a way laid the groundwork for the cultural changes that allowed him to collect all of these masks and sacred paraphernalia. Finally, the last reason that I think propelled the such a large purchase of masks by George Harley between 1928 and 1948 was the burgeoning market for African art. While Harley was on his way to Ganta in 1926, this article in the New York Herald headlines, "The newest art craze is Black African art." There was tremendous interest in African art, both in Europe and the United States. And by the time Harley arrives in Ganta, starts making connections, purchasing masks and so on from the local population, he also realizes, especially towards the end of this period that I'm talking about, the late 1940s, and then going on into the next period in the 1950s, that there was money to be made, not only in selling these masks beyond the ethnographic museum context, but also selling copies and replicas, which he ultimately becomes involved in. Before we move on to that part of my talk, I want to sort of take a brief autobiographical pause here and talk about how my ideas on Harley have changed over time. In 1986, when I was a graduate student at Harvard studying anthropology, I became involved in an exhibition project based on the Harley collection at Harvard. This was my first encounter with the Harley mask collection at the Peabody, and my research culminated in an exhibition in 1986 called "To Dance the Spirit: Masks of Liberia." After that exhibition concluded, I went on to do field research in Côte d'Ivoire, and my initial project was to do a restudy of Harley's research in the Ganta region of Liberia. In 1986, I couldn't get into Liberia because of an ongoing civil war in the country, so I spent a summer in the town of Danane in the western part of Côte d'Ivoire, which is also an area inhabited by the Dan, Geo, and the Mono ethnic groups. What I found when I was there was not so much an interest in masking and masquerades and the kind of work that Harley had done in his collecting and in his publications, but in fact was a thriving market for African art. And my research shifted when I went back in 1987 to 1988 to look at the market for African art, to work with primarily Hausa traders, and to study how art objects were being collected by traders among the local populations, and then ultimately being exported and marketed in the West. That work resulted in my first book, African Art in Transit, published in 1994, which is a study about the art market in Côte d'Ivoire and kind of the circulation of objects and the circulation of knowledge in the global economy. I had not thought about George Harley or the Peabody Museum collection for many, many years, and in 2012 I was invited by the National Museum of Art at Duke University to curate an exhibition about their collection of George Harley's work. It turns out Harley sold to the Nasher Museum, or actually to the Anthropology department at Duke, which then was given to the Nasher Museum, a small collection of about 100 artifacts in the early 1960s. And that collection had never been exhibited before, and my project was to curate the exhibition using the Nasher collection as well as Harley collections at other museums, including the College of William and Mary and the Peabody Museum. My re-engagement with the Harley materials led me to discoveries I had completely missed in 1986 when I curated To Dance the Spirit. At that time, I assumed all of Harley's collections were acquired for anthropological purposes and that he had no interest or connection to the art market. It turns out that through a series of circumstances in 1950, Harley's attention shifted from anthropological collecting to the collection of artifacts and works of art for the collector's market in African art. Harley had a falling out with Professor Hooton and Harvard. Their dispute was over how much was being paid for the mass and a feeling that his collection was being lost in the mass of Peabody Museum collections, and a dispute over his co-authorship with George Schwab's book, Tribes of the Liberian Hinterland. In a letter dated from 1950, Harley says, "At Harvard, my name has been completely lost." In addition to being frustrated with his relationship with Harvard, George Harley was also facing more and more personal expenses. In 1950, his eldest son Robert was in college, and his younger son Eugene was soon on his way to college and then to medical school. Harley needed money for tuition and scarcely could survive on his meager annual salary from the Methodist Board of Missions. Around 1950, George Harley was introduced to Paul Raboot, a commercial illustrator, graphic designer, and collector of non-Western art. Raboot had been collecting Northwest Coast masks and sculptures beginning in the mid-1940s, and through Harley became interested in Liberian masks and artifacts. We know that by 1950, Harley was engaged in collecting a great number of masks that were destined for sale to Raboot and then ultimately to other facets of the African art market in the United States. This extraordinary photograph taken by Griff Davis in 1950 shows Harley seated in his home in Ganta on the floor, surrounded by a large collection of masks. In the archives, we also have records of correspondence between Harley and Raboot, and in many ways Raboot was acting as a kind of middleman in which Harley would send first photographs of masks to see what Raboot was interested in. This is a sheet with these little cutouts of contact sheet printed masks that Harley was collecting. And Harley would then offer these for sale and price them in negotiations with Raboot, and ultimately would send the actual masks to Raboot in New York. During this period, Raboot was serving as a kind of middleman between Harley and some of the dealers and collectors in the United States, including Julius Karlbach, Alan Alperton, and Ladislas Seji in New York, as well as Boris Mirsky in Boston and Ralph Altman in Los Angeles. Raboot would essentially remove from the shipments the pieces that he wanted to keep for his own personal collection, and then would sell to these dealers on behalf of Harley after he had, as it were, skimmed off what he wanted to keep for himself. What's interesting, though, about the way the trade was being managed in the public imagination during this time is that many of the dealers who were collecting from Harley through Raboot and then selling to collectors in the United States were downplaying the connection to Harley and were talking more about having collected objects in the 19th century. So they were trying to kind of market what were essentially, in many cases, contemporary replicas that were being acquired by their gallery, especially by Ladislas Seji's gallery in New York City, for example, and then marketing these as though they were older objects dating back to the 19th century. This interview that was on WNYC radio broadcast in 1951 with the dealer, Ladislas Szegyi, a Hungarian-born artist who moved to the United States in the late 1940s and opened a gallery on Lexington Avenue in 1949, is a very revealing interview in the sense that it shows how this mythology was being created and perpetuated by some of the African art dealers in New York City. So let me turn to this interview for a moment.
Good afternoon. This is Lloyd Moss speaking, and presenting at this time a special feature of your city station's second annual American Art Festival. This afternoon, by transcription, we're taking you on a tour of the Szegyi Gallery. And to guide you through the gallery, here now is Mr. Ladislas Szegyi, director of the Szegyi Gallery. Good afternoon.
How do you do?
Why, first of all, I think we ought to talk a little bit about the gallery before we get on to a personal note and talk about you as an individual. How about that? Will you tell us how it happens that a gallery in New York City specializes in African art?
Well, I tell you, it was quite a venture on my part to start the gallery, but the answer is very simple. I love it. I have an awful lot of fun doing it, and I thought that probably there are some more people here in this big country of the United States who might feel just as I feel. That is to say, that African art gives a tremendous emotional thrill.
Mm-hmm.
You see, on that basis, because it's actually a human connection with the sculpture, I thought that there was a justification to open it. But probably you wouldn't know that. What I know is that this is quite a unique gallery, not only here in New York City, but also in the whole world.
Really? You mean it's the only one of its sort that specializes in African art, huh?
That's correct, because there's a lots of gallery which handles sculptures or handles primitive art, so-called primitive art, including South Sea or pre-Columbian, but I am specializing only in African art because I feel that there is such a tremendous material here that you have to know the thing. You
Absolutely.
have to study it. By the way, if I may place a little plug here, I have a book which will be published by A.A. Wynne in spring called African Sculpture Speaks.
Consider the plug placed.
Because the supply question is a very intricate one, due to the fact that in Africa they don't produce anymore the type of sculptures what I handle. I handle only what we call genuine antique sculptures on account of the infiltration of the Europeans, the missionaries and so forth. That whole art really died out. So presently what I have in the gallery are really old pieces, irreplaceable, and only way I can get them is from old collectors in Europe.
Well, that is the only way they'll come to your gallery?
That's the only way, and sometimes I have to put up really like a detective, you know, to work out who might have one, who might have a collection, how to find it, and again, that person who might be an old colonial may not know, as I know, the artistic quality. He just grabbed them, you know, during his stay as a curio, as a exotic object.
Yes.
Now, within that collection, I have to make a selection also, which one lives up to an aesthetic or plastic quality.
Yes, I can see that. But how do you know, for example, that this certain objet d'art was preserved by being placed on a family shelf? Do you actually have backgrounds on all these
Definitely.
things?
We know the different customs of different tribes.
Oh, that's where...
There's a lot of field report. By the way, in my book, I am using a bibliography of about 290 books and articles which I had to read in 4 languages in order to get the proper background material.
Mm-hmm.
So because I wasn't in Africa, very mainly for the reason because you can't find anything now there, I was consulting all the field reports or field studies which has been made way back.
Yes.
So my present experience is based upon those studies.
We know that beginning in 1946, Ladislas Szegyi was actively buying from Harley, who shipped objects from Africa. Yet the rhetoric in the interview focuses on the death of authentic African art. In fact, Szegyi's comments are typical of African art dealers and collectors beginning as early as 1900 right up to the present. Some of the key points include that there is no more sculpture produced in Africa, that I only collect from old collections in Europe, and finally that I don't travel to Africa because there is nothing left there to collect. I would argue that although Harley became involved in the art market around 1950, he never developed a good understanding of connoisseurship in the African art market. To him, there was in fact little difference between the replica and the original. His initial interest in collecting grew out of an anthropological focus on typologies. He tried to collect masks that fit the indigenous classification system according to their different functions in both religious and secular activities. So it turns out, in fact, that an enormous 4-foot-long Loma mask, which was accessioned in the Peabody Museum in 1937, was commissioned by Harley to fill a gap in his large collection of large horizontal masks from the forest regions to the west of Ganta. In order to satisfy the demand from dealers like Seji and others, Harley started buying replicas and also refinishing and repairing masks that he had not sent to the Peabody Museum in the previous decades because they were too badly damaged or broken. For masks whose surface was badly weathered or damaged, he developed his own formula to refinish the patina. The result is quite poor and looks nothing like the indigenous patina formulated from roots and organic dyes. In several letters, both Rabout and Seji ask Harley to stop repairing and refinishing masks, but Harley can. In the early 1960s, George Harley and his wife Winifred retired in Maryland, and they were visited several times by Alan Davis, who acquired a number of objects from the Harley collection. He also acquired Harley's recipe for the black or matte patina. Alan Davis donated the recipe to the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and we know now from the formula that it included black powder, varnish, turpentine, Japan dryer. A few months ago, I recreated the Harley patina with the ingredients that were on the recipe card, and I covered a Dan tourist mask that was in my collection with the Harley patina to see what it would look like. The patina goes on wet and sticky, and until it dries, it has a bright shine to it. And then once it dries, it becomes more of a matte surface, as you can see in this image. Before leaving Ganta for his retirement in the U.S. in 1960, Harley trained a handful of carvers from the lepers colony at the Ganta Mission to carve masks and statues for the replica market or the tourist market. It appears that some of the replicas were in fact taken from Harley's publication, Tribes of the Liberian Hinterland, which he co-authored in 1947 with George Schwab. Here you see a comparison of one of the masks from Tribes of the Liberian Hinterland, a mono face mask, with a replica of the mask. Again, we're fortunate that Alan Davis acquired several of these replica masks from Harley in 1962 and subsequently donated them to the Peabody Museum at Harvard. Let me end this talk with an interesting encounter between Harley and the American collectors Betty and Max Stanley. In February 1960, just a few months before the Harleys were to leave Liberia for good, Betty Stanley, the wife of business executive Max Stanley, flew in a single-engine airplane from Monrovia to Ganta. Betty had met the Harleys a few years earlier when they spoke about their work at the Stanleys Methodist Church in Iowa. George Harley was away from the mission, so Winifred hosted Betty for an overnight stay. Betty arranged to acquire several objects, including a game board, a pair of brass anklets, a few masks, and a, quote, Janus-formed carving used by the Poro elders for divination and personal protection. When Dr. Harley returned to Ganta, he reviewed what Betty Stanley had selected and approved the sale of the game board, which Winifred wrote in an accompanying letter, quote, he rubbed it up a little, so it now looks quite handsome." End quote. However, he did not approve the sale of the Janus form divination implement. Again, Winifred Harley wrote in a letter, quote, "The little Janus figure with hair is not the one you picked out. When Doctor came back and we looked things over, we found that the one you had chosen was the one and only original from which the copies were made. I was confused by the fact that the boy who had been blackening up the copies had got hold of that and blacked it also. Dr. Harley was not willing to let that go, but he has fixed up this copy and hope you will want this if the other can't be had." End quote. The little Janus figure continues to play an interesting role after Harley returns to the United States in 1960. He was visited several times by Paul Reboot at his home in Mary Point, Virginia, and in April 1962, Reboot spots the Janus form sculpture that Harley had taken away from the Stanleys. Again, Harley refuses to sell it. Reboot follows up his visit with a letter the following month, and he writes, quote, "You will recall that when I was in Virginia, I respected your wishes and did not press you to sell. But at this point I would like to bring all my powers of persuasion to bear in the hope that you will let me have the remaining 3 pieces that interest me." One of the pieces he indicates in the letter is the Janus figure, and he even includes a sketch of the figure itself. He says, quote, "I am your best customer, and for whatever it is worth, I would be very grateful for any special consideration that this might have on your decision." In the end, the Janus figure was never sold, and, as it turns out, I discovered, remained in the family, where it now sits on the mantelpiece in the home of Dr. Harley's son, Dr. Eugene Harley. Today, the value of a George Harley collected mask or artifact is greatly inflated by the market for African art. While a Harley attribution does offer some criteria for chronological dating, that is, it must have been collected between the late 1920s and 1960, it does not necessarily guarantee other traditional marks of authenticity, such as use value, fine craftsmanship, or an original age patina. Situating Dr. Harley within the framework of both his ethnographic collecting and his collecting for the art market helps us better understand, I think, the trajectory of Liberian art and artifacts, and reveals, at the very least, the complexity of an American missionary doctor who is intricately entangled in the complex history of African art and anthropology.